Andrew Sullivan, Andrew Sutherland. Andrew is a young Indian student in his final year of his master's degree in visual studies at Stellenbosch University. Forming part of a minority group at a historically white institution has steered his research toward transformation, decolonization, and the effective embodiment of space in a post-apartheid setting. So Andrew will have exactly 20 minutes to present, and then we'll open up for questions. We encourage people to put their questions in the chat while Andrew is speaking. So without further ado, Andrew, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kasonde. Would you let me know when the screen is up?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Perfect. Okay, so yeah, thanks for that. So as Kasonde said, my name is Andrew Sutherland. I'm in my final year of Masters in Visual Studies in the Visual Arts Department of Stellenbosch University. The title of the presentation today that I'll be giving is Behind Closed Doors, the Hidden Narrative of Graffiti / Vandalistic Inscription at Stellenbosch University. Just a quick look at the contents of my presentation. First, I'll go over background and context, which then leads me onto my research question. From this, I then look closer at my investigation, looking at 2 spaces of Stellenbosch University. And finally, I conclude with some outcomes and a conclusion to my investigation. Stellenbosch University's historical setting is one of exclusion, entangled with the ideologies and birth of the apartheid regime and Afrikaner nationalism, with notable alumni including D.F. Malan, H.F. Verwoerd, and B.J. Forster. The exclusionary space which Stellenbosch University still occupies were highlighted in the 2015 documentary Luister by Contraband Cape Town, and in the more recent 2020 documentary Waking Stellenbosch by Sarah Marecek. These documentaries detail the lived experience of a discriminatory and exclusionary space through the interviewing of students and lecturers at Stellenbosch University. Such experiences included abuse, discrimination, and exclusion based on racial, gendered, and sexual difference. One of the students interviewed comments on their exclusion from a normality of a daily lived Stellenbosch experience by stating, and I quote, "The color of my skin in Stellenbosch is like a burden. I mean, just walking into spaces, there's that stop, pause, and stare, where people cannot believe that you would enter into this space," end quote. The documentaries highlights how Stellenbosch University has not successfully enacted a transformative model, holding the university as an institutional space of inequality. This leads my research to question how a visual expression of exclusion and inequality may occur at Stellenbosch University. For this, I focus on an occurrence of graffiti / vandalistic inscription within 2 spaces of the university, namely the JH Marais statue on the Rooiplein and the toilet space within the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. These spaces were chosen in their dichotomy of public and private viewing respectively, and for their occupation within the daily experience of students on campus. In looking at graffiti, the term latrinalia is described by Joseph Kulfer and Jim Morrison as the intentional marking on the walls and doors of toilet spaces in the forms of drawings and writings, but it limits its use to the connotation of artistic graffiti. In my research, the graffiti analyzed will not be looked at solely for its artistic nature, but rather as inscriptions which somehow affect the space in which they occupy, and in the communication of a lived experience at Stellenbosch University. It is for this reason that I use the term graffiti / vandalistic inscription, to encompass various definitions and connotations surround graffiti and vandalism beyond the space of the toilet. Defining the expressive nature of graffiti as a form of vandalism and deviant act, utilized as a communicative tool against institutional power structures. As Irving Goffman states, and I quote, "The significance of certain deviant acts is that they undermine the intelligibility of everything else we have thought was going on around us," end quote. It is in this that I contend the occurrence of graffiti / vandalistic inscription within the private space of the toilet may hold a counter narrative to an established norm within the public spaces of the university. Henri Lefebvre's work, predominantly in his book, The Production of Space, speaks of space as something which does not exist as neutral, but but as that which is socially produced. In keeping with Lefebvre, I conceptualize space as a co-producer in social relations. This production takes into account the socio-political history of the space, rendering a precarious approach to Stellenbosch University as a space which was not founded on a neutral ground of equity. It is from this broader understanding of space as socially produced that I localize my investigation to specified spaces within the university, that being the JH Marais statue on the Rooiplein and the toilet spaces within the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Here, these spaces are presented within a dichotomy of their understanding of being public and private respectively, and is understood as such within their relation to one another. This image shows an aerial map view of Stellenbosch University campus. The investigated spaces can clearly be seen, with the JH Marais statue on the Rooiplein circled in red, and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences building circled in blue. The circled map shows the physical relation of these spaces in their location on campus. It is from this that I identify Foucault's heterotopic site as important in approaching these spaces, as their comprehension is seemingly understood through their paradoxical nature of viewing, that being public and private, and through means of access. In this, the individual spaces themselves hold paradoxical natures of public and private understandings, furthering a complex nature of spaces within the academic institution. My initial choice in these spaces is held in their relation to the daily experience of students at Stellenbosch University. As can be seen in the map, it can be said that the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences surround the Rooiplein space, and that the Rooiplein space lies at the heart of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. The relation of these spaces presents an opportunity to reveal how the physical presence of students embody these spaces. As stated, the Rooiplein lies at the center of the university campus, with recent publications explaining it as, and I quote, a central gathering place for students on campus, end quote, and as one of the main social hubs where students from all faculties converge. For the public to engage and encounter this space, one need not necessarily be a staff, student, or visitor of Stellenbosch University, but access to the spaces open within the understanding that the space is in the view of the public. While access to the Rooiplein is open, the space is under constant surveillance by the university through means of security cameras and security guards. The public viewing of the Rooiplein space also speaks to general definitions of graffiti. In its basic premise, the term graffiti refers to the scratching or drawings of inscriptions on a surface intended to be viewed by the public. De Miller defines graffiti as, and I quote, written cultural phenomena making use of symbolic and iconic language, end quote. These phenomena are seen in the use of writing by means of various tools such as paint, spray paint, and markers on public and private property, all within public view. Societal views of graffiti are varied. In his article, Graffiti Taking a Closer Look, Grant differentiates between the view of graffiti as a form of street art or communicative dissidence to the generalized societal views of graffiti as a problem, ranging from that of a crime to that of a mere nuisance. At the heart of the Rooiplein stands the statue of Jan Marais. Such statues show vital as a public space of gathering and protest. During times of protest, these statues offer a public access to the plights of institutional oppression and a space to protest where full public visibility is granted. These contentious spaces are one which hold inquisitions to the statue's effective associations towards a continuous historical hegemonic rule, represented by these vestiges of an old regime. These inquisitions render the contentious space of the JH Marais statue on the Rooiplein as a standing representation of the hegemonic rule of Stellenbosch University. The management of the university has attempted to counter this effective association through an acknowledgement of the financial contribution of JH Marais toward the founding of the university, and posit that the continued standing of the statue holds a welcoming nature toward a progressive environment for diversity. While the university management may attempt to divert the associated discourse surrounding the JH Marais statue, the effective nature of the statue was highlighted during the 2015 protests surrounding the Rhodes Must Fall movement. Graffiti/vandalistic inscription-styled phrases were utilized in the protest action as a communicative tool toward a truer reflection of the effective nature of the statue and the associative environment the statue creates. This image shows a photograph of the graffiti/vandalistic styled phrases pasted onto the JH Marais statue. Most notable Most notable in the phrases are the headings of the 4 posters. These change the name of JH Marais to JH Marais. These posters then highlight the association of the founding of Stellenbosch University as an institution which played a key role in the architectural landscape of racial oppression in South Africa. One of the posters directly states that, and I quote, JH Marais funded my exclusion in 1915, end quote, directly suggesting the role of figures such as JH Marais at Stellenbosch University in the racial politics of South Africa. This is further exemplified by another poster which deems JH Marais as the father of the birthplace of apartheid. Further from this, these posters can also be seen to be pasted over the inscribed information of the statue, palimpsestually re-inscribing the contextual information surrounding JH Marais. What can be stated from these examples is that graffiti/vandalistic inscription within the public space of the university is used as a communicative means during times of protest. However, this is not seen on a day-to-day occurrence of the space. While remnants of the graffiti/vandalistic inscription is seen day-to-day, while remnants of the graffiti/vandalistic inscription from times of protest remain on the statue, it is rather an absence of graffiti/vandalistic inscription which is seen day-to-day. The space seems to remain within a state that reflects an established norm of a peaceful and harmonious university, as without a daily occurrence of exclusion and inequality based in racial, gendered, or sexual difference. The private space of the toilet holds restrictions firstly in its access. First and foremost, toilet spaces restrict access based on gender. Because of this, my research is limited to my gender, that being male. And as such, the graffiti/vandalistic inscription investigated in these spaces has been limited to the male toilets only. A further level of restriction in these spaces are seen based on one's access to the institutional buildings of the university. The toilet spaces are restricted through one's affiliation or citizenship to Stellenbosch University. In order to access the buildings which house these facilities, one must either first be a student, staff, or accompanied visitor, gaining access to the buildings through the use of a student or staff card. Once again, the graffiti/vandalistic inscription investigated is limited by my own access to the institutional buildings and toilets, that being within the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Critical approaches to the toilet space show itself as a vital element within a post-apartheid South Africa. Naledi Yazio states that, and I quote, "The toilet in the new South Africa then is a fragile space, a space that threatens to strip naked some of the Rainbow Nation's representation of itself," end quote. Reflecting on Goffman's statement of deviant acts as undermining the intelligibility of everything we thought was going on around us, so too then does the toilet space hold an opportunity to undermine the intelligibility of everything we thought was going on around us. Foucault's heterotopias facilitate an understanding of the toilet space through its relation to other spaces on campus. Much like the decomposing bodies within the cemetery speaking to the mortality of the visitor, so too do current occupants of the toilet space become aware of previous occupants. The privacy of the toilet space then becomes fragile. Yazio states that, and I quote, "This then seems to be the reason for the prevalence of graffiti on public toilet walls. The toilet, by its very nature, is already a space that presupposes the existence of other spaces, and toilet graffiti is a tangible manifestation of the toilet's paradoxical nature," end quote. The discourse of the graffiti/vandalistic inscription found is thus presupposed by an effective environment within other spaces of the university, representing, contesting, and inverting norms within the culture of the institution in which it is situated. These graffiti/vandalistic inscription are thus afforded the opportunity to function within a hidden narrative of experience at Stellenbosch University. The private and secluded nature of the toilet allows for a more open and engaged narrative on generally accepted taboo subject matter within institutionalized spaces. This allowance for a more open and engaged narrative within these spaces is substantiated by Yazio. In this, Yazio states that the toilet spaces offer an opportunity for seclusion and anonymity, seemingly leading toward a willingness to engage in otherwise suppressed conversation. This subject matter is shown in the found graffiti/vandalistic inscription to fall within the themes of historical oppression, that being in racial and sexual difference. These themes of historical oppression show themselves as identification markers for the author of the graffiti/vandalistic inscription. These identification markers are presented within race and sexuality group identities and are used to mask an individuality of the graffiti/vandalistic inscription writer toward a confirmation of a group identity. As can be seen in the image, the use of the pronoun we speaks on behalf of a group identity, which becomes identifiable through the subject matter of the graffiti/vandalistic inscription. This inscription is thus presented to the viewer as being written on behalf of a racialized group identity, utilized in a communication of socio-political relations within the broader environment. Hans Assenbaum proposes that the anonymity of the graffiti/vandalistic inscription writer, and I quote, consists of as much identity creation as it consists of identity negation, end quote. Anonymity's power of both identity creation and identity negation is encapsulated by Ruiz, who claims that, and I quote, the mask does not negate identity. Instead, it signifies the possibility of a multiplicity of identities. It suggests a way of thinking about blankness as a means not of only erasing difference, but also as a means of articulating difference, end quote. Thus, the toilet space graffiti/vandalistic inscription writer dons a mask of anonymity, allowing for the negation of their personal individual identification for the visage of a group identity. Furthermore, the graffiti/vandalistic inscription in the image speaks directly to a continuity of a historical exclusionary oppression based on racial politics, through the use of the past and present tenses weren't and right now, respectively, in an explanation of the social relationship between racial groupings. This relationship is seemingly on a larger geographic scale than the university, but holds strength in its location within the university, embedding a historical narrative of racial politics onto the institutional architecture. Themes of race and sexuality found in the graffiti/vandalistic inscription were often not separated from each other, but rather used as an intersection of experience. As can be seen in the image, the graffiti/vandalistic inscription reads, and I quote, "I wish all white people could suck my colored dick," end quote. This firstly identifies a narrative of racial difference, utilizing categorizing markers such as white and colored. Judith Butler argues for such identification categories as, and I quote, instruments of regulatory regimes, end quote, identifying an apprehensive relationship between discourse of identity politics and the embodiment of these discourses. Further from this, the graffiti/vandalistic inscription shows a call to action within a sexualized behavior. This call to action does not present itself within an openness of sexuality within institutional spaces, but within a more aggressive and demeaning manner, intersecting a negative effect of sexuality within racial difference and is seemingly used as a tool of power. This aggressive and demeaning manner can be seen as a reflective of the apartheid regime's prohibition of sexual intercourse between people of different racial categories and restricted homosexual activity through the euphemism of unnatural and immoral sexual acts, as seen in the Immorality Act of 1957. An intersection of racial and sexual discourse is seen again in the same toilet space. As can be seen in the image, there is a call to action based on race and sexual behavior. In this toilet space, there are three separate inscriptions with similar subject matter within a close proximity to each other. What can also be seen in this graffiti/vandalistic inscription is the use of arrows to mark the responding inscription. Rodriguez and Claire state that the rhetorical form of graffiti/vandalistic inscription invites participation, forming dialogue and continuous narrative through the inscription of response to a primary inscription. The use of arrows in this graffiti/vandalistic inscription then identifies the primary and responding inscriptions. These speak to an idea of viewership and response, formulating a hidden narrative of themes which speak directly to a historical context of the institution on which they are inscribed. The responsive nature of the graffiti/vandalistic inscription speaks to an idea of forming a palimpsest. The use of the term palimpsest is seen in a post-structuralist understanding as, and I quote, a metaphor for the re-inscription and legibility of discourses situated within institutional power structures, and for the re-examination of subjectivity, end quote. This further holds the potential for the action of inscription to assert a sense of ownership and belonging within the greater institutional space of Stellenbosch University. To conclude, the outcomes of the research show how the governing of public spaces within the academic institution has led to an absence of a day-to-day graffiti/vandalistic inscription, while the space is shown to be used during times of protest. This suggests that such public spaces are utilized as a stage of sorts within the organization of protest action and see a suppression of an everyday narrative. This shows as opposite within the private space of the university, sorry, the private toilet space of the university. In these spaces, there exists a hidden narrative at and of Stellenbosch University. The graffiti/vandalistic inscription in the toilet spaces of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences speak to themes on race and sexuality, showing how these themes within the academic institution are not devout from one another, but occur within an intersection of exclusion and inequality. The toilet graffiti/vandalistic inscription thus is showcased as a counter-narrative to an established norm within the public spaces of the institution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was really fascinating. Before we open it up to other questions, Prof. Noor has to leave. I don't know if he's already left. Yeah, I think he has. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand or type them in the chat. But as we wait for other people to think about questions, I just have a question. While I was going through your paper, and it's interesting that you, before the seminar started, Ariana was asking you about your master's research, and you're looking at Facebook. And I was wondering, while reading your paper, how you see, you do argue that through the vandalistic inscription or graffiti in the toilet, there's sort of an identity formation, negation of the group identity. But I'm wondering, maybe this is more of a psychological question. I'm wondering to what extent you think there is, in the sense of identity formation, not just negation of group identity, but sort of solidifying personal identity. I'll give you an example. When I went to college in the States, I never thought of myself as Black, right? So you could argue I was adopting a group identity. So how do you think this inscription, whether through racial identity or sexual identity, sexuality, is playing to these psychological themes of personal development? And I think I'll ask Dr. Lisoni Ariana to ask her question.
Thanks, Kasonde, and thank you, Andrew. I wanted to ask you to, if you could please tell us more about the context in which these graffiti inscriptions emerged. So the kind of political moment you mentioned roads must fall, but I wanted to know more about what was happening on campus at Stellenbosch and what were the debates, and you know, if you could say more about that context and the history of the statue itself in relation to these protests. I also noticed you don't directly reflect on that, but the inscriptions on the statue are in fact on posters and other pieces of paper, not directly on the statue. And you know, what does that then say about the politics of space and the production of space that you refer to on the university campus? Yeah, I think I'll leave it like at that. Maybe another question. I just wanted to know if you see any relation between the two spaces that you consider in the paper, beyond, you know, the observations that you've made about one being a public space and one being a private space, if they are related to each other in any other way. Thanks.
Okay, so we don't seem to have any other questions at the moment. I think we can take, you can respond to
Yeah. Okay, so I think looking at your question, on this sort of psychological of identity formation, I think it's quite interesting. At the moment, I'm doing research into, the psychogeography of the built environment. And one of the things that has really come up is this idea of the university institution itself as a liminal space. The sort of space between being a dependent, let's say, child and being an independent adult. And I think that, the university space itself actually allows for oneself to question these identity formations. Even myself growing up, I never considered myself as Indian. I actually come from a mixed racial background. And there was never this questioning of what race was until you get to a certain age. And all of a sudden you start to question your own personal history and the history of your sort of racial identity within broader contexts. And I think that, that was brought up again recently in the protest actions in Durban, where I actually grew up. In the sort of the Indian townships that were there, where I still have family that live, there were threats on their life, and it brought up a lot of remnants from my own parents' and grandparents' generation of protest actions within those spaces from 1942. I think it brought up to them the 1942 riots, where there was sort of persecutions based on race between non-white and non-white, between Indian and Black. So just looking at that psychological, it's interesting to see how these identity, you sort of, especially in Stellenbosch University, I think the context of the institution itself speaks a lot to how formations of identity play a role coming up. If that answers your question. Cool. And then just to comment on Ariana's question, so the context in which the graffiti occurred. So between Open Stellenbosch in 2015, 2016, and the Roads Must Fall movement protest, there were a number of incidences at Stellenbosch University that had occurred. A lot of the times we don't talk about these. For example, there was the HF of Wood plaque, which was only brought down in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. The plaque honoring HF of Wood, as well as an incident of Nazi-styled posters that were posted around campus. And so the context in which these graffiti occur, the wonderful part about, or the not so wonderful part about the toilet graffiti is that there's no sense of direct ownership of an individual, and there's no sense of dating when these had actually occurred in the spaces. And so it becomes this wonderful investigation where every time you go in, there might be new added graffiti, or there might be a complete wiping out of the graffiti that was there. So that's something that I actually had noticed in going back in 2020. I had noticed that some of the graffiti that I had photographed that I had shown today had actually been erased by the university. And so we see this, one of the things that it spoke to me about was this idea of inscription, the university's response to this inscription by not reading and responding directly, but to paste over these, and then there will be a new re-inscription of graffiti that will then go on there, adding layers upon layer of narrative within the university space. And then on the posters versus the graffiti, I also found it quite interesting that it was posters on the statue versus an actual inscription on the statue itself. There were incidences during the protests where there were things done to the statue, but I also found it quite interesting on the posters, but haven't given it too much thought beyond that. I hope that helps.
All right, thanks so much for your responses, Andrew. We have a comment, I think a comment in the chat. I don't know if the person wants to come on and talk, or should I just read it out? Greer Valley.
We know Greer Valley well at Stellenbosch.
Okay, really? They're your colleague. Okay. The plaque was brought down in 2015. I think this is referring to the Verwoerd plaque.
Verwoerd Park, yes.
Yeah. After Open Stellenbosch was started, it was a pre-emotive action taken by the university in response to Rhodes must fall. Okay, so just adding to the conversation.
It's actually quite interesting because I've been looking at the Facebook pages of Open Stellenbosch as well as Stellenbosch University for my master's research, and the removal of the Verwoerd plaque, it's almost posited by the university as unprompted by anything such as Open Stellenbosch, and yet there is this backlash, and there was a wonderful protest that happened during the removal of the plaque. I think Greer would actually be the best person to comment on that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, they're in a noisy place. Would have loved to hear more about that. But I think Laura has a question. Yeah.
Thanks.
Please.
Sorry, I can't raise my hand in the normal way. So my question, Andrew, thanks very much. Very interesting. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how the graffiti and related comments kind of in these spaces are interpreted by different groups on Stellenbosch campus. If you have much insight into that, you've referred already to kind of management taking quite a particular approach to this. Do you have a sense whether students from different backgrounds perhaps interpret this in different ways, staff interpret it in a certain way, management, and if there are kind of differences within some of these larger groups, staff of a certain generation perhaps versus staff of a younger generation? Thanks.
Yeah, I haven't really chatted to much of the students about their responses to such graffiti. There was an incident in our own department a couple of years ago where there was an occurrence of very racialized graffiti in our own departments, and the response to it was quite rapid. I tried to rush to the toilet to try and get a photo of it, but unfortunately it had been already taken down. And there was from that instance, there was a general disgust by students, especially in my cohort. I think during that time I was in my honors year. But I haven't really seen any general responses to graffiti as a whole within students, within the student cohort. I have had conversations with a colleague from the history department, Dr. Chet Franch, and he found it very interesting. He had also done a short investigation into graffiti in the toilet spaces. In fact, he had helped me out with a lot of this, the ideas for this research itself back in 2018, I think it was, yeah. And he was sort of focused more on the absence of graffiti within institutionalized spaces. I grew up with my parents being academics. I grew up on the UKZN campus as well as the Durban University of Technology, spaces that are inundated with graffiti, also more artistic graffiti, and yet within these sort of hegemonic institutional spaces such as Stellenbosch, there seems to be a lack of artistic graffiti, and there seems to be more of this narrative that speaks to very highly racialized and sexualized discourses.
Interesting. So perhaps this is a bit of repetition of Dr. Lisoni's question, but I'm interested in how you conceptualize the JH Marais statue as a stage rather than, let's say, a canvas, for lack of a better term, a canvas for the graffiti, right? I know maybe Greer would have said more about the protests that went around that, but do you know anything about, the thought process, that sort of the dynamics among student groups, why they chose to use it as a stage? Is this a long-standing tradition that particular statue is used as a stage for protest.
Yeah, I'm not too sure if it would be the statue itself that would function as the stage, but rather the Rooiplein as a whole. You know, it is surrounded by the administrative buildings of the university. It's also this liminal space that lies between the academic buildings and the student center building, you know, where everyone would go for lunch. And as the quotes that I use stated, it lies at the heart of the campus. It's where all students from all faculties converge. And it's also, so it shows itself as the sort of space outside of the administrative buildings where the management of the university as well as the students can converge and be watched. You know, it's quite a panoptic space, looking at the security cameras and also the windows from these academic and administrative buildings of the university.
Interesting. Yeah, and I'd like you to say more about Lefebvre, because I used him for my master's research as well, but from the perspective of library spaces in Soweto, right, and how these spaces were used by the state to the intention was to promote a certain, you know, ideology, but students sort of subverted the spaces. I mean, some of the meetings on June 76 were held in the library spaces, and librarians actively helped students. So I know you kind of talk about how the entire university, very interesting how you talk about how public spaces and semi-private spaces, the Lu, which is private but public at the same time, how they interact. But perhaps you could say more about, you know, the production of the university space in general, speaking to Lefebvre, and also the different spaces on their own. And then we have a question from Ali, Dr. Longwane, which, yeah, maybe you can comment on that, because I'm still grappling with Lefebvre. I mean, I have the thick book that I'm trying to make clear. And then we can go to Dr. Longwane.
Yeah, I also took me quite a while to get through the production of space. I got the physical book, and I remember it being quite a moment in, you know, I got it toward the end of my undergraduate degree, and I thought, finally, I'm going to read an entire book. I remember making it through the introduction and saying, okay, this is quite a bit. But it's interesting when you speak about, you know, ideologies and library spaces, because something that I didn't mention was that the Rooiplein is actually the roof of the university library. So it is the largest underground library, I think, in the Southern Hemisphere or the world, I'm not sure. But the Rooiplein itself was actually physically constructed to be the roof of the library, and to sort of have this heart of knowledge at the heart of the campus is quite interesting. You know, the ideologies of Stellenbosch University, and you know, there are also interesting images that lie beneath the library or within the library spaces themselves. You know, speaking to the history of Stellenbosch University and the certain icons that, or, you know, these vestiges of an old regime that live within these spaces. But you know, part of my research onto the Rooiplein space, I actually delved into the archives at Stellenbosch University, and I found it quite interesting the way that the building of the Rooiplein itself had been, and the library had been explained. It was very, very sort of arbitrary, stating that the amount of bricks used could travel from Stellenbosch to the moon and back, for example, stacked to one on top of each other. So it was interesting to see the way in which this sort of, you know, this heart of ideology and knowledge within Stellenbosch University has been explained by these documents that live within the archive spaces of the university. I think there's a lot more research that can and should be done in these spaces. I think my research here is very much an introduction to what would lie beneath and what lies behind the closed doors of the institution. If we approach, I remember there was actually a specific moment that changed the way that I viewed my time at Stellenbosch. There was it was an incident of a racialized microaggression, shall we say. And suddenly I started to view the space in a very different light, and I started to look for all these micro situations that happen within the institution that you might not look into or give a second thought to. I then walked into the toilet spaces, which then, allowed myself to view it very differently. And I started to read the graffiti that was present in these spaces, and started to question how these then represent maybe a micro situation within the university, and toward microaggressions of racial. Yeah.
Oh, wow, fascinating. So Dr. Longwani's question is, what is the relationship between graffiti and the poster tradition? What do the different spaces, landscape, and the body of the person wearing the t-shirt mean in relation to body and space?
That's very interesting. I think poster tradition is something that I hadn't looked into. It's certainly something that I will look into. And I mean, this is something you see a lot in protest action. You see people are printing t-shirts, they are making posters. It's always something that is carried by the person in a form of communication against these power structures. And I think that the space in which these happen are very, very important.
I think Ali said between graffiti and the t-shirt tradition. Yeah, I think that's the question.
Yeah, I'll be honest and say that I'm very unsure about this t-shirt tradition, but I'm going to look into that. Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. And Njogu, Dr. Morgan writes, following on from Kasonde's comment, what do you make of the content in the toilet space? The overwhelming presence of sexualist, racist discourse versus other types of language or protest. In relation to other studies of graffiti in toilets, is there something to be said of the private space that just lends itself to sexualized discourse? In this way, the space of the toilet has that agency?
I think what really needs to be restated before that is that first and foremost, it is a gendered space. There might be cases where we have gender neutral toilets that are coming into the forefront, but in a general sense, they are gendered first and foremost, and that needs to be reinstated. So any sort of discourse that happens further from this is within that gender. Within that gendered looking. Yeah, I mean, in terms of sexualized discourse, the toilet space is somewhere where, if one looks at sort of queer identities and the history of queer identity, we see the toilet space as the space in which the seclusion allows for this anonymity, and the seclusion allows for a more open and engagement with sexualized behavior. There's always, if one thinks of Alan Turing himself, the father of modern day computing, we see that he had also engaged in this type of behavior within the toilet spaces. That was the call. I don't think I would be the best person to speak about that, but the toilet space itself is very much sexualized in terms of its use within history.
Yeah, also because there was need for secrecy, right? It was illegal to be seen elsewhere. Right, very interesting questions. Yeah, so I'll just give maybe one last call for questions. I feel your project is fascinating, how you use these spaces to tell a story. Dr. Phillips.
Thanks. One other question, something that I've been thinking about in terms of Wits campus, and do you have a sense, Andrew, what COVID has done to the use of space and the use of space to make political statements on campuses without students being physically present, or perhaps some are, certainly not in the way they used to be? Are messages made on different forums?
That's actually a very interesting question. There was an incident in the last couple of years where there was this initiative of classic paintings that were created as murals that were put around the university, with the subjects of these paintings wearing masks and sort of speaking to, we're speaking to, the wearing of a mask and such, and COVID safety within the university. And then suddenly one also saw graffiti being posted on these of don't be compliant, only sheep wear masks. And these very sort of anti-COVID sentiments that were being posted on top of these paintings. I think that would be a very interesting thing to look into. But definitely, I've realized through teaching of the first years at Stellenbosch that there's a big impact on COVID on the university experience of students. And I don't think that it's helping this sort of this clique of or racialized differences within the university. I think it's actually creating a bit more of a divide. They're not, on top of students not being able to afford technological things such as laptops and internet. I think that there's suddenly a disconnection between students and allowing to actually form groups within themselves. A lot of learning I found has been done through, generalized conversation between students on campus, and suddenly that has been taken away.
With the internet, though, do you feel it mirrors some of, especially with your recent research, these spaces? I mean, people have talked about how social media, has helped start revolutions around the world. And I'm from Zambia, and in the recent election there, where the sitting government was removed, very, very oppressive government was removed. People have, there's no research on this yet, but people have said the youth vote, and particularly the opposition's engagement on social media, helped that. But with connected to Laura's question, do you see that there are spaces on the internet where these conversations, virtual toilet stalls? I know that there's some groups on places like Instagram where people can submit anonymous, comments, drag someone else. Is this just putting people in their silos?
I don't think so, actually. It has been interesting not just to look at the visual images that are used by the university, for example, but it's interesting to see the comments that are being posted, because all of a sudden there's a name and a profile picture of the comments that are coming up. And there seems to be a very great divide. We sort of seem to be perpetuating a dichotomy of either for or against what is being said. There's no generalized comments on things that are happening. It's either, yes, this is great, or no, this is terrible. Why are we changing everything? So this is again something that's been seen at Stellenbosch recently with the changing of building names. We had one of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, actually one of the buildings that I had circled, name changed from the Wilcox building to the Quatoa building. And the comments that are coming up on there are the same rhetoric that we've seen throughout times, with the changing of street names, the changing of, I think it was PE, for example, to Nakwebecha. People are, well, why are we changing the past? Why are we doing this? And other people are absolutely celebrating this, saying, yes, it's about damn time. So we see that the social commentary and this political commentary is being put onto this online network, and it's becoming a bit more open. People have now greater access to it through smartphone applications. We are getting notifications of these comments that are coming up, and people are able to respond directly to these. Suddenly the arrow marker that you've had to use a pen for in the toilet space, you're now getting a notification, and it's going to be at Kasonde, or at the person that they're responding to. So we can actually see how these political comments are being reflected on an online platform.
Interesting. Thanks, Andrew. Do you have any closing remarks, like some parting words for us?
Maybe not parting words, but I'm definitely looking forward to the next time we meet on here. I've been attending these sessions, and I must say they actually have been fantastic. I think that this is a great initiative that's been put through, and I'm hoping to see a bit more engagement with other universities. I know that I've seen a couple of people from Stellenbosch on here, and I'm hoping that they will also attend the next session, and just to see what it's about. The emails that I've been getting from the history workshop has been fantastic. I've been able to see exactly what's going to be happening, and I just wanted to commend you guys on really holding a great seminar session.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew Sutherland. Thank you everyone for attending and for the great comments and questions. As we said, the seminar has been recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. And we have the next webinar in a couple of weeks. You receive an email about that. Thank you, everyone. Have a good Wednesday afternoon.
Thanks very much, guys. Enjoy your week further.
Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Kasonde. And we'll be in touch.
Thanks, Ariane.